responsibility model in the Azure cloud. This is very important for you need to understand. Why this is important? Because irrespective of your role and responsibility in public cloud, you must understand this model because this will define, or as an admin, you will leverage or use this model to configure identities, to configure their access, which is known as role-based access control in Azure. So you will configure RBAC for identities based on the shared responsibility model. Depending on which service from Azure cloud platform you are consuming or you are building, you are provisioning, what service delivery model does it fall under, which is IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, you will have certain responsibilities on your shoulder as an admin, and you will need to configure the service keeping in consideration those responsibilities so that your service is configured as per the security best practices provided by Microsoft Azure as well as industry experts, and your service aligns with the regulatory compliances and standards if it needs to, and there is no misconfiguration in the service. So this is very important for you to understand, because when it comes to cloud, you are sharing responsibilities with the service provider. In an on-premises data center or on-premises deployment, which is fully managed by your company, the admin team, the IT team are fully responsible for the management and maintenance, which includes security also. But when you host your application in a shared environment, in a shared infrastructure, you will share certain responsibility with the infrastructure provider. And in that case, it is Microsoft Azure. So let's understand the responsibilities. Now, let's try and understand this image from right to left. So when you see on premises, you see all the boxes as blue. So here's the legend. Blue stands for customer, and the sky blue or whatever you call it, it stands for Microsoft, and then the one which is half it stands for shared. Then look here, look here, these responsibilities always retained by the customer. Responsibility varies by type, and responsibility transfers to cloud provider. So what Microsoft says that we are responsible for certain things, and we will always remain responsible for those areas. Customers do not need worry about it. For example, anything which is physical. So the physical data center or data center security is Microsoft responsibility. You can see the physical host, physical network, and physical data center. It is Microsoft responsibility. So they are responsible to put in place appropriate measures to safeguard the data center, which includes electric wall fencing, CCTV cameras, guards, biometric devices. All that comes under physical data center security. Physical data center security, perimeter security, whatever you call it. That is the responsibility of Microsoft. You can see in the IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service. However, in on-premises, it is customer who is responsible for it. Then comes PaaS. In PaaS also, Microsoft is responsible for physical security. Then comes SaaS. You can see in SaaS also, Microsoft is responsible for infrastructure security. So which means that for physical infrastructure, it is the cloud service provider who is responsible for security. Then comes the specific services that a customer is going to deploy in the cloud. And based on the category that the service falls under, the responsibility for security will vary. It will move from one shoulder to another. So if it is IaaS, and if you are provisioning an operating system will basically mean that you are provisioning a virtual machine. So if you are provisioning a virtual machine in IaaS, then that virtual machine is your responsibility, is customer's responsibility. It basically means that the customer is responsible for configuring that virtual machine, considering the security best practices, ensuring that the virtual machine operating system remains up to date all the time, ensuring that the customer has deployed an endpoint detection and response or an antivirus, anti-malware, anti-spyware solution on the virtual machine. If it is required, then the customer will also deploy a DLP solution on the virtual machine itself. So the responsibility to protect the operating system, which is nothing but the virtual machine, is the customer's responsibility in IaaS, infrastructure as a service model. In platform as a service model, it is the responsibility of Microsoft. Why? Because in platform as a service model, you are only responsible for your application and data that it generates, or the data that you store, which your application needs. Infrastructure is the responsibility of Microsoft. So it is the responsibility of Microsoft. In SaaS, also it is the responsibility of Microsoft. Then comes network, which relates to virtual network, firewall, network security group, all the networking services. Now, if you see the networking services in IaaS is also the responsibility of customer. Why? Because when you provision a virtual network in Azure, it is your discretion whether you want to take a smaller address space, a bigger address space, an address space from class A, class B, class C. It's your discretion. It is your discretion whether you want to deploy DDoS firewall to protect or safeguard your network. It is your responsibility if you want to configure network security group rules to filter the incoming and outgoing traffic from to your virtual network. So since it is your responsibility, I'm saying since it is in your control as a customer, the network control is customer's responsibility in IaaS. However, in PaaS, it is a shared responsibility. Why? Because the infrastructure is being managed by the customer, and some controls Microsoft is also taking into consideration. So that is why it's a shared responsibility wherein you will decide that what app service plan you would want to go with, what will be your application environment in terms of you whether you want to use Java, .NET, ASP. You will configure all that in your app services, and accordingly it will be a shared responsibility. However, in SaaS, it is your responsibility. I'm saying it is Microsoft responsibility completely because SaaS means a ready-made solution like Microsoft 365, Dynamics, SharePoint Online. Those are the examples of Microsoft SaaS products. So that is where Microsoft manages the network control. Then comes applications. Now, in case of IaaS, it is customer's responsibility because it is your application. You decide which operating system you need. You decide how your application will communicate, whether it will be internal or in internet facing. So it's your responsibility. However, in PaaS, since it's an app service plan, it's a shared responsibility. It is between Microsoft and customer. In SaaS, it is completely with the Microsoft. Then comes the identity and directory infrastructure. Now, this is where you will create your user accounts, employee accounts. Either you create them directly in Azure AD, or you will synchronize them from an on-premises Windows Server Active Directory using Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Connect Sync to Microsoft Azure Active Directory. So in that case, in IaaS, it is completely your responsibility as a customer. However, in PaaS, identity and directory infrastructure is a shared responsibility because the infrastructure is managed by the Microsoft in app services, in PaaS services, and that is where they also are responsible for the authentication and authorization of those services. So it's a shared responsibility, basically, identity and directory infrastructure. In SaaS, it is the same case. It is a shared responsibility. Then comes accounts and identities. So your subscription, various accounts that you create or identities that you will configure, applications that you will configure inside Azure Active Directory will be completely your responsibility. So you will be provided a directory service in the name of Azure Active Directory from Microsoft, and it will be a tenant of Microsoft Azure Active Directory, which is the bigger service, and you will have complete control on the tenant, which basically means that you can decide how do you want to provision identities, whether you want to provision cloud only identities, guest identities, whether you want to synchronize identities from on premises, how do you want to manage various accounts and subscriptions, whether you want to use management group, whether you want to manage them individually, all that is your discretion. So it's customer's responsibility. Then comes devices and mobile. It's customer's responsibility in all the service model, because customer will not be forced by Microsoft to use only a specific brand of laptop, let's say HP, Dell, Lenovo, Mac, Apple. Customers can pick and choose any laptop and use Microsoft services. Mobile, same case. You will not be forced as a customer to only use Android based devices or iOS based devices or Windows OS based devices. It's your discretion. And since it is your discretion, as a customer, you are responsible to safeguard the devices and PCs, which basically means that you will be enforcing controls on those mobile devices as well as endpoints. So you may want to deploy an endpoint detection and response solutions like Windows Defender or CrowdStrike or McAfee Semantic, anything that you would like to go for. So that's what your responsibility is. Then comes information and data. This is again customer's responsibility. Microsoft will only provide controls in terms of security controls for safeguarding the data. For example, Microsoft will give you capability to encrypt the data, decrypt the data. Microsoft will give you capabilities to capabilities or services like Azure Information Protection, Microsoft Information Protection, using which you can run a discovery of the data which is stored across various repositories. You can classify and label that data, and basis on labeling and classification, you can apply DLP policies. You can apply right management services. So all that, so the capabilities and tools will be provided by Microsoft. However, the discretion will be at the customer's hand whether they want to use it or not, or whether they want to use a third party solution. And that is why information and data will always be the responsibility of the customer. Microsoft has absolute no play here. Whatever I'm saying, Microsoft will never ever restrict you that you will only be able to upload this format of data. I'm saying you can only upload Microsoft Office based data, which is PowerPoint, Excel, Word, Access, Outlook. You will not be able to upload PDF files. You will not be able to upload Google Apps data. No, that's not what Microsoft does. So it's your responsibility. So this is the shared security responsibility model. And unless you understand this model, you will really not know what you need to secure in cloud. Whether you are responsible for the security of the service or Microsoft is responsible for it, or whether it's a shared responsibility. So it is very critical to understand this model, because when you are going to work with Sentinel, which is a security monitoring solution, while you are investigating an incident or while you are creating analytics rule, this understanding is very important. It should not happen that you unnecessarily end up creating rules for a responsibility that goes on Microsoft's shoulder, and you are unnecessarily creating incidents for it. So, and vice versa. Something that you are responsible for, you assume that it is the Microsoft responsibility, and then you ignore it. You ignore that event, you ignore that alert. So it is very important for you to understand. Now, on the same slide, you will see some explanation of what I have just explained. Give it a quick read and let me know if you have any question on this. All right. So you can focus here. It says irrespective, the last line, which says irrespective of the deployment model, the customer will always be responsible for data, endpoints, which is mobile devices, laptop, desktop, virtual machines that you provision, accounts, and access management. Account here means identities. Now that identity could be a human identity, which is a user account, a non-human identity, which is like a managed identity, or a system identity, or a service account. So accounts and identities and the access management, which is the access that you will grant or permission that you will configure for the identity, is customer's responsibility all the time. So that's what the shared responsibility model in the Azure cloud is. Similarly, if you need more information, you can refer to this URL. This will basically give you enough information, will give you basically information about the more information about this model. So I'll share this URL with you all. Okay, I've just put them into the chat window. Now, similar to Microsoft Azure, all the three leading cloud service providers like AWS, they've also provided a shared responsibility model in which AWS says that security of the cloud is my responsibility. Security in the cloud is customer's responsibility. And this model is a bit complicated because when you say security in the cloud, you also need to clearly mention what is that security in the cloud, what all services are involved here. And that is what AWS is trying to explain here. But since AWS is not explaining it, taking into consideration the deployment models, it becomes a bit difficult for customer to understand it. It is a bit confusing here. However, Google, it is simple. It is something in synchronization with what Microsoft says, that yes, these are the factors, these are the responsibility types, and here's the deployment model. Depending on the deployment model, the responsibilities will continue to vary between Google and the customer. And Google also says it's a shared fate. Shared fate basically means that if something untoward happens, it is not only customer who will get impacted. Google as a business may also get impacted. For example, if you provision a compute engine in Google Cloud and you use that compute engine for some illegal activities, I'm saying you are hosting a betting website or anything which is against the law. And if it is ever came to light, the law enforcement agencies will not only penalize you, they will also penalize Google at the same time, blaming Google for not putting in appropriate measures to audit and validate what their customers are doing. So it's a shared fate. On the other hand, if Google Cloud gets compromised, if Google Cloud is experiencing an outage, if Google Cloud data centers are down, the customer who is using that specific data center or region hosting their mission critical application, they will also suffer an outage. They will also experience it. So it's a shared fate. So Google says that it's a shared responsibility and shared fate. So together, we need to be responsible to make sure to safeguard the security of the cloud, which Google owns but is used by the customer to host their mission critical applications and workload. That's what Google says. So on the same presentation, you have the shared responsibility model for all the three leading cloud service provider, and you see the difference in how they are interpreting or representing that model to the customer. All right. So that was about shared responsibility model. Guys, feel free to ask questions if you have any. Don't keep it to yourself. If you ask, people may consider you a fool for 5 minutes. You may consider yourself a fool for 5 minutes that how come I don't know this very small thing, very basic thing. But if you don't ask, you will remain a fool forever. You will never ever know the answer of that question. So ask without bothering about what others think of it. Since this is a mixed match, when I have people who has absolutely no idea on cloud, specifically Google Cloud, some people have some basic idea but no idea on Sentinel. Some people are from engineering background who are primarily working with the consulting, discussion, architecture, solutioning. Some people are actually, winning the bread and butter for the organization, who are into operations, who are bringing recurring revenue to the organization from their customer engagements. So it's a mixed match. Ask questions, whatever comes to your mind. I will make sure to answer that question or guide you in the right direction if I don't have ready-made answer. Thank you. All right. Now, today we are going to cover some security services or some most common, most useful services in Azure Cloud, which will build the foundation that we will need at the time of using Sentinel. Because Sentinel is a security monitoring service, it needs logs. Those logs will come from data sources. Those data sources are nothing but the services that you will have deployed in the cloud, or your admins have deployed in the cloud, configured it, and now Sentinel is given the responsibility to analyze the logs coming from those services, identify if there is any misconfiguration, if there is any probable security incident that is waiting to happen, and then alert the user, alert the SOC analyst or SOC team members so that they can investigate, they can discover the vulnerability, and they can either remediate it by themselves or forward it to the next level or share it with somebody who is responsible to take care of it. That's what Sentinel does. So it's a small tool in the universe of Microsoft, which has 200 plus services, and Sentinel has the capability to monitor majority of the services. So we cannot go with all the services, but we will go with some most common services, most critical services in the Azure cloud, which Sentinel needs to communicate, which Sentinel needs data from to provide an effective all-round security strategy. So let's talk about those services. Give me a moment. Let me open. Is the Word document visible to everyone?
Yes.
Okay. So our first service is Azure Active Directory, and this service is very important, when it comes to Microsoft Azure, because this is the service that admins use to provision the initial skeleton, or when it comes to minimum viable cloud, when it comes to landing zone. I'm saying now I'll be using some terminologies which we primarily use in cloud, which primarily practice team, consulting team, architecture team, engineering team uses. So we use the concepts of MVC, which is minimum viable cloud, or we use the concept of landing zone in AWS. Now, what is this MVC and landing zone? This basically means that before a customer migrates the very first application or server into the cloud, or before a customer starts to build a cloud native application, there has to be a skeleton that needs to be built into the cloud. a minimum set of services that needs to be configured so that those services can then be used to put the applications when they are migrated into the cloud or to build the application, to support the application build environment. That's what minimum viable cloud is or landing zone is. Now, what are those basic services that you need to have? The very first service that you need to have is a service using which you can do authentication of various users who are trying to connect to cloud, log into Azure portal, and you can also do authorization. Authorization basically means that based on who that user is, what is the job role and responsibility of the user, a decision can be made to provide some capabilities, some permissions, some policies to the user, and user will work within those permissions. User will not be able to do anything above and beyond. That is authorization. So you need a service for authentication and authorization. You need a network. Why you need a network? Because without a network, you will not be able to host your service, and you want your service to remain isolated. I'd say when you are building applications, when you are migrating applications or workloads into the cloud, you need a network similar to what you have in an on-premises, which is local area network, or VLAN, which is virtual local area network when you segment your LAN into multiple virtual LANs. So you also need a network so that you can restrict the resources, restrict the applications, and you can create a boundary around it. You can define the boundary so that who will be able to access the application, who will not be able to access the application. In Bangalore, Mumbai, Chennai, and most of the IT cities, now you have special economic zones, SEZ Park, software technology parks. And what happens in those buildings? They are multi-story buildings. In those buildings, you will have multiple companies operating who are sharing the same infrastructure. Even though they are sharing the same infrastructure, the building administration is able to send them separate bills for their power consumption, for various resources that they are using. How? Because they have created that segregation. And that segregation is always created in cloud by creating a network. And the companies themselves have also created a segregation. On the same floor, you have two competitive firms operating. The employees are using the same lift. The employees probably are using the same cafeteria. The employees are using the devices from the same manufacturer. It is Dell laptops which company A and company B employees are using. However, there is something that differentiates. That something is the directory service, authentication and authorization, and that network. It is differentiating between two laptops. So if you put two laptops belonging to two different employees of two different companies, they could be from the same brand, but the moment you want to open it, there will be an identity which is configured, which makes them identical. There is a network in which they will only work, which makes them identical. So that's the network infrastructure. Other than network, you need compute services, you need storage services, and you may need some miscellaneous services, which is, let's say, databases or anything over and above. You also need security. Now, this authentication and authorization network and VLAN, this is all security actually, but I will still write security services. So you also need security services like a firewall that you will use to secure your perimeter, secure the DMZ, so that all the traffic that is coming inside your network is getting filtered at the firewall, at the perimeter, and based on the policies that you have configured. You may have virtual firewall, you may have a physical firewall, it hardly makes any difference, or you may have entire traffic getting routed from an on-premises, firewall. It's nothing but the configuration. But at a bare minimum, this is something that you need. This is what you need at a bare minimum to build a minimum viable cloud or a landing zone in AWS, Azure, and GCP. Now, you may say that I would need two more services. Point is taken. Yes, depending on who you are, what kind of applications you intend, or you are planning to migrate in the cloud your specific business requirements, you can add some more services. But at a bare minimum, you need an authentication and authorization service. You need a network. You need security configuration, native security services configuration. Even if you don't want to go with enterprise, you need native security services configuration. All the clouds provide you firewall. They provide you, uh, a proper firewall which has the capability to filter the network traffic or network packets based on the rules and policies that you configure. They have the capability for IDS, IPS. They have the capability to filter the traffic based on the content, URL, FQDN. It is not only port filtering firewall, it has more capabilities. And other than that, in all the clouds, you have an additional layer of security which is safeguarding your compute resources, that is known as NSG, SG, or SG. So NSG in Azure, security group, and security group in AWS and GCP. So you have these services which are natively available that you need to configure. And then without a compute, whether it's a server or serverless, what you will do, you will either need server or serverless service to host your application. So that is also needed in cloud. Without this, you will not be able to build a service, or you will not be able to start operations into the cloud. So this is what is known as landing zone or minimum viable cloud. So let's discuss some services which constitutes a landing zone or minimum viable cloud in Microsoft Azure, focusing on Microsoft Azure. So MVC is the terminology provided by Azure. Landing zone is the terminology provided by AWS, and GCP also uses the same terminology. Okay. So I was talking about the first service, which is authentication and authorization. In Microsoft Azure, the service that we use for authentication and authorization is known as Azure Active Directory. And most recently, Microsoft has renamed it. I'm saying they are actually in the process of renaming it, which is Microsoft Entra ID. I just don't get the you know sense here that why it is Entra ID. I'm saying this Azure Active Directory is very it makes perfect sense because most of the people who are from Microsoft background, they already understand what an Active Directory is. And the Active Directory that we use in on premises as part of Windows Server role, something that we use to manage our identities and resources in an on-premises environment. When it goes to Azure, it becomes Azure Active Directory. It makes perfect sense. Why Microsoft is renaming it to Microsoft Entra ID, I don't get it. But since they are renaming it, let's go for it. What Microsoft is saying that we are adding more capabilities to it. This is not only a directory service, this is also a security service. So we came up with this name, but I don't get sense of this name. So this is Azure Active Directory, which we use for authentication and authorization. Now, how it happens? Now, people who are from engineering background, this is very important for you to understand. Same is the case with operations. If you don't know what happened behind the scenes, you will not be able to understand it always. So try and understand what happens behind the scenes so that you will not have gap in your knowledge. Now, what happens? How you get all of this? So when a customer, let's say when an individual or a business signs up with Azure, which means when you create your account with Azure, exactly what you did yesterday, you basically redeemed an Azure sponsorship pass and you created an account with Azure. Now that sponsorship pass was a prepaid pass. It hardly makes any difference. If it was not a pass, then you would have provided your credit or debit card information for Microsoft to authenticate and then charge that payment method on monthly basis for the services that you consume. So, so when you are signing up with Microsoft Azure Cloud, or when a business sign up with Microsoft Azure Cloud, you basically pick and choose a specific model, specific relationship model, which could be a free trial, which could be a sponsorship pass, which could be pay as you go or an enterprise agreement. These are some models. You have more, which is dev test and many other models also, but these are most common models. So what you did yesterday, you basically redeemed a sponsorship pass. And as part of that redemption, what you got in return, you got an Azure subscription with $100 worth of credit valid for 30 days. That's secondary. So you got an Azure subscription. And this Azure subscription that you have got, you become the account admin of this subscription. Other than this, you've also got Azure Active Directory. So other than Azure subscription, you have also got a service from Microsoft, which is free of cost, which is Azure Active Directory. And this is nothing but tenant of Azure Active Directory. So why do I call it tenant? Because Azure Active Directory is the main directory service that Microsoft uses to authenticate and authorize various customers who are using Microsoft Cloud services. Now, when I say Microsoft Cloud services, it includes Microsoft Azure Public Cloud. It also includes Microsoft Dynamics. MS in short stands for Microsoft. It includes Microsoft 365. In short, we call it M365 now. It includes Microsoft SharePoint Online, etc. So any Microsoft Cloud service that you will start your relationship with, that you sign up for, you will get an Azure Active Directory tenant. Now, why do you get a tenant? When there are 1,000 businesses who are using Microsoft Azure Cloud, those businesses, when they log into Microsoft Azure or when they log into their respective account, they basically provide their email, which is username and password. This is what you provide. So when you sign up, you basically provide your email, username, phone number. Microsoft also accepts Skype ID and password. And with this information, you sign up. Now, this information, along with the additional information that you provide, will be stored in Microsoft directory service. And every time you log in to that portal, and so let's say you signed up with Microsoft Azure Cloud Platform with this information, and after that, you are logging into Microsoft Azure Cloud. So every time you are logging into Microsoft Azure Cloud, you're providing this piece of information. And this piece of information is stored in Microsoft Directory Service, and this directory service is known as Azure AD. So when you provide your email, your username and password, this information will be sent to Microsoft Azure AD, who will then authenticate and authorize and let you log into the portal. So you log into the portal, Azure portal, with this information. Now, after that, you will need more people to access that portal. For example, you are a business, you've just signed up with Microsoft Azure. Now you want your employees to also log into Azure portal so that they can do their respective work, so that they can build and migrate applications. For that, you will need to create your employees' identities. So when you create identities, either you have identities already available for your employees in on-premises, or you want to create identities in cloud. For that, you need a service, which is Azure Active Directory. Now, when you create identities or synchronize identities from on-premises, those identities will also log into cloud. So when these identities, let's say when these employees or users, when they log into Microsoft Azure, when they type portal.azure.com and they get the screen to sign up, wherein they type their email ID or their user ID, and then the next screen is asking for their password. Now between this screen, this user ID and password screen, what happens? When they type the user ID, this user ID is sent to Microsoft Azure Active Directory, which knows that this user ID exists in one of the Microsoft Azure subscription or account, which belongs to this specific customer. And then the information is sent to the Azure Active Directory tenant that the customer manages, and that tenant will basically validate this user ID, whether this user ID exists or not. Once that tenant validates that the user ID exists, then the next screen, it will be asking for the password. When you provide the password, the information goes to the Azure Active Directory tenant, which is attached, to which your subscription is attached to which your account is attached to, and then the tenant authorizes that yes, the password is correct. And with this both in piece of information, user ID and password, tenant also knows that what level of access this identity has in Azure, on both Azure Active Directory as well as on various subscriptions which are associated to Azure Active Directory. So that is the overall process. So never ever get confused within tenant, subscription, and Azure Active Directory. Tenant is nothing but an instance of Azure Active Directory, the global Microsoft Azure Active Directory that has been provided to a customer, so that customer can create their own identities and have them authenticated to Azure portal using that tenant. Subscription is nothing but a container in which you will deploy your cloud services. Subscriptions are attached to tenant. You can create multiple subscriptions. The person who signs up with Azure becomes the account admin. Account admin is also, so if you sign into your Azure subscription and go to subscription page, you find yourself as account admin. Your role is account admin. Your role is account admin for the entire relationship with Microsoft. However, if you talk specifically from the subscription perspective, the Azure subscription that Microsoft has granted you, for that subscription, your role is owner. So you are owner of that subscription. Along with that subscription, you are being provided an Azure Active Directory tenant, and your role in that tenant is global admin. That is your role. You basically maintain two roles: owner at the subscription level and global admin at the Azure Active Directory tenant level. And then you also are an account admin, wherein you can manage your relationship with Microsoft. In future, if you wish, you can subscribe to more services from Microsoft, like M365, Dynamic SharePoint. You can also close the relationship with Microsoft. You can cancel a subscription, cancel a service. So that's what account admin is all about. So this is how we start our journey with Microsoft Azure. Now, this process differs from one cloud to another. Why it is very important for you to understand, because this is where most of the people have gaps. They can't differentiate between a subscription and a tenant. And that is where they're not able to manage the multi-cloud environment. They're not able to manage the multi-tenant environment because they don't have the clarity on the basics, on the concepts. So this is very important. Now, Azure Active Directory is a service that I typically deliver training for 5 full days, 40 hours, which means in 40 hours, I try and cover the entire Azure Active Directory and various services that it provides, that it brings on the table. Since we have very limited time, and today we need to complete all the core services, I will not get into the depth of it, but I will try and cover those services from a very high level so that I'll build the base, so that you will at least have some basic idea about the service, or you will have heard the name of the service and you will know what do we use this service at a very high level. That's the ultimate goal of today's session. So that's on the Azure Active Directory. Now, other than providing authentication and authorization, Azure Active Directory provides a lot of security capabilities also, because it is also a security service. And when I say a security service, you can also configure a lot of security capabilities here. Example, you can configure multi-factor authentication, which basically means that only user ID and password is not sufficient for users to authenticate and authorize. The users will also be challenged with an additional factor authentication, which could be a one-time password that they will receive on their registered mobile phone, which could be an email that they will need to look for and look for that code and enter. It could be a push notification on their mobile phone. It could be a software like Microsoft Authenticator that they will deploy, using which they will do the authentication. It could be an RSA device also. It could be a FIDO security key also. It could be Windows Hello, which is what we use for MFA as well as passwordless authentication in Microsoft Azure world. We can also use Microsoft Authenticator for passwordless authentication, which means you don't need to type the password. You don't need to remember any passwords. Just to type the user ID, your username, and the authenticator will help you to sign in without providing the password. So there are ample opportunities which are there when it comes to MFA. It provides another capability, which is conditional access. What conditional access is, that based on the device or the user or the location or the specific service that the user is trying to access, a decision can be made whether to allow access or deny access. That's what conditional access is. Microsoft Azure AD also provides you an advanced conditional access, which is risk-based conditional access. It also provides you identity protection. It also manages the identity lifecycle, which is access package creation, identity, uh, you know, creating access package, uh, applying those access package to various identities. So it provides you that also, which is known as accreditation. So the entire identity lifecycle management, Microsoft Active Directory is responsible for. You can also use Microsoft Active Directory to use your custom domain. So let me show the same from the portal, that it would make more sense to you. So since I'm the account admin, the entire authentication and authorization happened at Microsoft Global Directory, and it allowed me to log in. However, if there is an identity that belongs to my Active Directory, now this is my Azure Active Directory tenant that I have, which Microsoft has provided me. I'm using the free version of it. There are 4 versions of Microsoft Azure Active Directory: free, Microsoft 365, Premium P1, and Premium P2. Based on the versions, you will get the features. So this is the free version that I use, because the paid version has a cost based on the number of identities that I provision, and I don't want to pay that cost because I use this account for training. So this is my free version. Now over here you will see that it says that my primary domain is cloudexpert.com. So I own this domain. What happens when you sign up with Microsoft Azure as an individual? You may not have a domain, and without a domain, you may not be able to configure a couple of services. So what Microsoft does, Microsoft gives you a custom domain, its own domain. In on-premises, that domain is contoso.com that you can use. And in cloud, Microsoft gives you a custom domain, which is the ID that you have signed up with. This is the ID. You can see Raghuveer underscore. It removes underscore backs. It removes underscore or any underscore or any special character or any symbol that you have used. It only uses the alphabets and numerics. So Raghuveer Singh 2016 Hotmail. It will remove .com also, and it will add its own domain, which is on Microsoft.com. So with this on Microsoft.com domain, you can host a website, you can configure a public service in Microsoft. That is why Microsoft provides you a custom domain and say its own domain. However, if you don't want to use this Microsoft on Microsoft.com, because if you do, people will know that the service is hosted in Azure, in Microsoft, then you can add your own domain also, the one that you own. For example, I've added cloudexpert.com here. It's verified, and this is my primary domain, which means all the services that I configure in this directory will use cloudexpert.com as the domain suffix. So this is the service that Azure Active Directory provides, which has nothing to do with authentication and authorization. And that is why it is a multi-talented service. So you get as custom domain. Similarly, for security, when you go to security, you get all of these capabilities. You get Azure AD conditional access. You get Azure AD identity protection. You have Azure Security Center, which is now renamed as Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So Microsoft just needs to update the portal here. You have Identity Secure Score, which is also part of Microsoft Defender for Cloud now. Named location, which is a service which is used inside Azure AD conditional access. Authentication methods, which is where you will configure the authentication methods for your users, which is basically whether you want them to use uh, whether you want them to use a FIDO security key, Microsoft Authenticator, SMS-based authentication, temporary access pass, third-party software, voice call, email OTP, certificate-based authentication. So you can see all of this information is configured here. So we've configured this authentication methods also. So you can pick and choose one of the authentication method. Let's say I pick and choose authenticator. So I'll select authenticator and then I will enable this authentication method and I'll select the customer and I'll select my users. So if I want to configure multi-factor authentication for my users, all the users or all the identities who are part of this Azure Active Directory tenant, I'll come to the screen, enable the authenticator, and then I'll select the target, whether it is for all users or a specific group of users. So I'll select all users and save it, which means that next moment onward, when a user tries to sign in, user will be challenged with the additional factor authentication, which is Microsoft Authenticator. User will get a prompt after typing the password that your organization needs some additional information. Please go ahead and download an Authenticator app on your mobile and configure it. So that's how you can configure it. The multi-factor authentication based on Authenticator. And similarly, other than Authenticator, you have all of these authentication methods available that Microsoft Active Directory, Azure Active Directory provides. Now, some authentication methods require you to spend some additional money, additional dollar value, some additional money. Some authentication methods free of cost. For example, email OTP is free of cost. There is no charge for it. Microsoft Authenticator, free of cost. SMS, there could be a cost if your telephony service provider charges you for incoming text messages. But from Microsoft side, it is free of cost. FIDO security key, it's a hardware. It requires investments. Third-party OAuth tokens, investment. Voice call, investment. Certificate-based authentication, investment. You need to configure it and spend some additional penny to leverage this service. So these are the security capabilities. And this is where you can configure the policies, conditional access policies. So these are all the security capabilities that Azure Active Directory brings on the table. You can see here it shows you risky users, risk workload identities, risky sign-ins. Now, all of this information will be fed into Sentinel. When we get into the Sentinel part, we will integrate Azure Active Directory, or we will configure a data connector of Azure Active Directory to send logs to Microsoft Sentinel, so that if there is any security service which is configured, let's say MFA is configured, and the user is trying to authenticate but typing the incorrect credentials again and again on the MFA device, then it could be a brute force attack. It could be a hacking attempt on the identity. This will be converted into a log. That activity will be converted into a log. That log will be sent to Sentinel. And based on the analytics rule that you have configured, the log will, that event will get converted into an incident. So we will do that in Sentinel. And that is why understanding of these core services is important, because I am going to use these core services in Sentinel training. So this is where you see all the security capabilities that Microsoft Active Directory brings on the table, which is conditional access, identity protection, security center, which is now Defender for Cloud, where Microsoft Entra verified ID, a secure score, named location, multi-factor authentication, certificate authorities, all of this it provides. This is not all. It also provides you an opportunity to configure single sign-on by signing up for enterprise applications, or by by configuring your applications here, so that you can delegate users and you can configure single sign-on for those applications. Now, in this account, since I deliver training for Azure and GCP also, I'm saying AWS and GCP also, at the same level that I deliver in Azure, I have configured single sign-on with AWS and GCP, which basically means that if I am a large business, large enterprise, who is a multi-cloud, who has workloads and applications configured in Azure, AWS, and GCP, and I want my employees to have access on AWS, Azure, and GCP also. Will I be managing identities in three different cloud? Will I be having three different AD admins, one for Azure, one for AWS, one for GCP, and then a one for on-premises Active Directory also? Will I be creating that identities directly in all the three clouds? There are so many questions that comes to an enterprise when they try and go multi-cloud. And that is where this capability comes into the picture that I've configured, wherein you don't need to do anything. You must have a directory service that you will surely have, which is like a Windows Server Active Directory or a third-party Active Directory service, which supports Kerberos authentication. So what you will do, you will synchronize all your identities from your existing directory service using this capability, which is Azure AD Connect in Azure Active Directory. Once that synchronization is complete, all your identities will start to reflect here in this window, which is user window. For example, I have 155 identities here. Now, all of these 155 identities will then can then further be granted access to enterprise applications, to other clouds in this case, which is AWS and GCP. By configuring a single sign-on here, you will just select your user that needs access to AWS. Here, the user information will be here. So, for example, these are the users from my directory who have access to AWS account also. And similarly, these are the users from my directory who have access to Google Cloud accounts also. So I am not directly creating identities in Google Cloud or AWS Cloud. I am creating identities in on-premises, synchronizing them in Azure Active Directory. And from Azure Active Directory, I have configured single sign-on for Google and AWS, which means Azure Active Directory is my only source of identity. That is my directory service or identity source, single identity source, where I will manage all my identities and grant them access to various applications. Now, those applications are not only AWS and GCP. You can also add applications like any application that has the capability to accept authentication. For example, SAP. If you're using SAP, you can also integrate SAP with Azure Active Directory. And going forward, all SAP-based authentication. I'm saying if SAP needs user to authenticate before the user is granted access to SAP module, then you will have Azure Active Directory to take care of it. So it's a great service that you have available. So somebody has a question, Yogesh. Identity created on Google Cloud will appear here, or do we need to create here? Yogesh, can you repeat your question? I didn't understand it. Yogesh, you're there?
Yeah, I can hear you. So basically, you are saying all Google Cloud, AWS identities can be managed via this Azure enterprise application, right? So
Yes.
suppose I want to create a user. So where do I need to create the user? Here do I need to create the user in this
So
portal or I need to create the user in Google Cloud directory.
you're not creating any identity in Google Cloud, in AWS, or in SAP, or any enterprise application that you configure here. You are using your identities which already exist in Azure Active Directory. When you configure the application, when you click on that application, there is an option of users and group. So this is where you will grant users and group access to this application. So this is AWS single account access, let's say one application. So what I will do, I will basically add my users and group here. So I'll select my users from here. These are my identities, and these are my users in Azure Active Directory. I'll select the user here, and I will assign this application to the user. Now the application is assigned to the user. Now what user will do? User will basically click on this. User will basically type this URL myapps.microsoft.com. So when user types this URL myapps.microsoft.com, user will see all the applications that has been configured for the user, that has been configured for single sign-on, which means user identity will never ever access, will never ever exist in the enterprise application. Enterprise application will only use Azure Active Directory to authenticate the user and provide appropriate access. This is what is known as sole identity. This is known as single identity source. And this we basically use, for example, this user that you see here. This is my user. This user has been granted access to these many applications. Now, all of these applications requires individual authentication. But since I'm using single sign-on here, this user will only authenticate once when the user logs into Microsoft Azure. And after that, this user will never ever need to authenticate. User can directly click on any of the application and user will get access based on what permissions you have configured. Now, your next question should be, where do we configure the permission? So permission will be configured at the application level. So if I have these users, for example, let's say I have these users, Kapil, Kishan, Raghuveer, all of these users exist in Azure Active Directory, and they do not exist in Azure Active Directory. These users have been synchronized from on-premises Active Directory, which means the identity source here is on-premises Active Directory. So your on-premises Active Directory admin is managing the identity. He or she is responsible for it. So the user is created in on-premises Active Directory. Then the user is synchronized into Azure Active Directory using Azure AD Connect. Once the user starts to reflect in Azure AD, then an enterprise application is added to Azure AD, and the user is granted access to that enterprise application. The level of access, the permission, will be configured at the enterprise application itself. That is how it works. Just for the clarity, let me quickly show you. So if I log into AWS console, you can see I have MFA configured here because I'm signing it with the root user. The root user is similar to account admin in AWS, and you must need to protect your root user account. Okay, so this is where I find it difficult to remember passwords, and very soon I'm going to configure passwordless for all my accounts. All right. Now this is AWS portal, and this is where the users you will see. I'm saying what happens when you will configure this enterprise app, when you will configure the integration single sign-on with AWS, you will provision, I'm saying your users exist in your directory. You will add users in the app here, and then these users will start to reflect into the application, which is AWS portal here. So inside the AWS portal, if you go to users tab here under IAM Identity Center, all users you can see reflect here. Kishan, Ramesh, Kapil, Test, Raghuveer, Shivam. You can see all the users are reflecting in AWS. So now that the users are reflecting in AWS, but the permissions on AWS will be granted here itself, because your Azure Active Directory or a third party cannot decide or do not have capability to grant permission, because that console, that API is not available. So this is where you will grant the permission. How do you grant the permission? You will select the permission sets. This is the permission set that you have created here, where you have defined a permission. For example, these are the permission sets: administrative access, view only access, which is administrative access is like contributor. View only access in Azure is read only, database administrator. So you have defined the permission sets. You will click on a permission set here and you will add user here in the permission set. So you can see this is the permission set. And whenever you need to grant access, you will select the account. Let's say in AWS, I'm using 3 accounts. So this is one of my customer. I was delivering a training to a couple of employees on, for this customer, and they also happens to be a multi-cloud customer. So they have a couple of applications hosted in Azure and AWS, and they were tired of managing identities and their permission individually in both the clouds, and they really needed a solution, because a lot of misconfiguration happened because of this multi-cloud management, multi-identity management, and they also experienced a couple of security incident. Now, looking at the name, you will understand how critical is a security incident for this customer, because they are part of BFSI domain. So they are very stringent when it comes to security and identities. So they needed a solution, and they approached me and they said that we needed a solution so that we can manage our identities in one place. We don't need to manage at 2 different places, because that way we will need to hire 2 employees, one who is an expert in Azure, the other who is an expert in AWS. And then we already have somebody who is an expert in Windows Server Active Directory. So this is unnecessarily increasing our cost and administrative overhead, which is resulting in security incidents. What can we do about it? And this is the solution I provided, that okay, let's use this capability of Azure AD, wherein you will use Azure AD as your single identity source, and you will configure those identities and synchronize them in various enterprise applications, including AWS, SAP, Oracle, Hyperion, and any other application. And you will manage the identities at Azure level or on-premises level. So this is how you grant access. So now you've selected the account. You just need to select the account. For example, this account I want to grant access. I'll select the account here, test account. Then you will see users and group here. I will click on assign users and group. I'll see all my users. I'm saying you will not see group here. You will need to type for a username. Why you're not seeing a group? Because I don't have premium P1 subscription. So I will select the user here, and over here you will see all the users. So I'll select the user whosoever needs access to this account. So let's say I selected this user and click on next. Select the permission for this user, that what level of access needs to be granted to this user on this account. So I'll select, let's say, view only access for this user, and click next and submit. Now this user, Kishan Kumar, is getting view only access on AWS cloud. And inside AWS cloud, there are multiple accounts, because imagine this customer has multiple AWS accounts. So all of those accounts have been added inside root, which is the organization. AWS has a service with the name organization that we use. So with organization, all of these accounts are added here. And now you can grant your identities access to these accounts and permissions for the individual accounts. So that is how you're managing identities at one place, and you are enabling the SSO and MFA for those identities using Azure AD. So this is another capability of Azure AD that it brings on the table. Not only the identity and access management, but it is also responsible for SSO, MFA, and security services. It is also responsible for you can also configure mobile device management from Azure AD. You can also configure some additional capabilities. So as I said, Azure AD is a lengthy topic which takes a couple of days to complete if you want to get into the detail of it. But at a very high level, what you need to understand is that this is one of the security service. This is not a service for identity and access management only. This is a security service. Probably why Microsoft decided to change the name, because people perceive it incorrect, that they think that it is only for identity and access management, but not. It is for a lot of capabilities. Yogesh, did that answer your question?
Yes, Raghuveer. Yeah.
Okay. So the configuration that I am showing you with AWS, Azure, and GCP, this is the configuration that I first configured for another bank, which happens to be a multinational bank, which has operations in India, Singapore, Malaysia, America, Europe, not in Australia, Europe, and then some part of South Africa. And so it's a multinational bank. I actually configured this service for this bank because the bank is using both AWS and GCP, and Azure is their primary cloud, wherein they started with Azure and they have 60% of their workloads hosted in Azure. Then they didn't want vendor lock-in, so they started using AWS and GCP also. And they came in the same situation that now they have multiple identities, multiple clouds. How do they manage them all? How do they ensure the security? So this is where I got into the picture and I configured this entire configuration that I'm showing you. And this is something that you do not configure in a day. It takes a couple of months because it is like a project that you deal with, and it has a lot of bits and pieces that you need to connect and then do it. But what you are seeing is the end result of it. So I really found value in that configuration. I thought of replicating that configuration in my account so that I can demonstrate it to my users when I'm delivering a training on identity and access management, or when I'm delivering a training on cloud security. So that is why I also did this. I also replicate the configuration in my account so that you will see an exact replica of what happens in production when you want to manage multiple identities. Similar to this, I will also show you a demo typically on the last day of the training, that how do you manage multiple accounts, multiple subscriptions, multiple tenants when you have a single team, which is a single SOC team comprising of 5-10 people, but there are 100 customers, and you need to manage the security for all of them. So how do you manage all of them using the combination of Azure AD with Azure Lighthouse, all the customers, and each customer is separate. You're not mixing the data, you're not doing any mixing and match. It's a separate management that you will do, something that I will demonstrate probably on the last day of the training. And then you will see the value of Azure Active Directory in synchronization with Sentinel using Lighthouse, and then you will see how do you manage. Okay, so this was about Azure Active Directory. Let me see if there is anything that I want to discuss here. So Active Directory, user provisioning, conditional access, tenant subscription management. Okay, one last thing, then we'll take a break on Azure Active Directory. That, as I said, that as you get a tenant here when you sign up with Azure, Azure gives you a tenant of Azure Active Directory. So you get a tenant. Now, how do you manage tenant? What if you want to create more tenant to segregate your application infrastructure, probably non-prod and prod, or to segregate specific business units? For example, you have a couple of BUs in the company who have their own P&L, profit and loss. They manage their P&L by themselves, and they have very low dependency on the central management. They have their own stakeholders. They are functioning inside the company, but they are a separate entity in itself. So if you have such scenario, how do you manage? So you can see here it says Azure AD is becoming a Microsoft Entra ID. So this is where you manage it. So you will click on manage tenants, and here you will see your tenants. Now you can see I have two tenants. I have a Microsoft tenant, which has Microsoft.on-Microsoft.com domain. Then I've created a separate tenant, which is my default directory for configuring all that I have just shown you, which is registered with Cloud Expert domain. Similarly, you can create more tenants here, and you can associate subscriptions with the tenant also. So first you will create a tenant, then you will create subscriptions. So for example, let's say there are two tenants here, then you will navigate to subscriptions. And when you add a subscription, right now there are two subscriptions in this account, and these two subscriptions are associated to default directory tenant. Let's say you want to create a new subscription and associate it to a different tenant, you can do it here. So you will first select a subscription type, the association with Microsoft. For example, I'm not eligible for free trial anymore. I can do pay as you go or Azure for students. So I'll select this offer and I will sign up. Here I will need to provide some basic information just to ensure that which tenant this subscription will belong to, which payment method will be used to charge the billing of this subscription. All of this information I'll provide here, payment information, service user, technical address, all of it. And this new subscription will be created. And this subscription will be shown under here, which will be attached to a tenant. So that's the concept of subscriptions and tenant in Azure that you must have clarity on. If you don't have clarity here, forget about managing multi-cloud environment, forget about managing multi-customer using your SOC, SOC initiative. You need to have good clarity here. Otherwise, you will mix and match. You will end up mixing the logs of one customer into other customers' tenant, and that if that ever happens, you already know what will happen. So that is where it is very important for you to understand. So that is all about Azure Active Directory at a very high level that I want to discuss. Right. So we are done with the authentication and authorization service, which includes some additional capabilities that it brings on the table, and the service name is getting renamed as Microsoft Entra ID. Then comes network. Now, the network service that we have in Microsoft Azure is known as virtual network. And this virtual network is very important because you will first create a perimeter and a boundary inside which you will keep your resources and applications. So what we basically do, we build a virtual network in Azure with an address space, which could be class A, B, and C private IP address. So that's what we build. Now, networking and virtualization, they are the backbone of cloud computing. If you really want to get good comfort level in cloud computing or with any public cloud, you need to have good understanding of networking and virtualization. Why? Because you will not only deal with one cloud, or you already are in a scenario wherein organizations are now using multi-cloud. You're not in 2010, where there is only one cloud in the name AWS and Microsoft has just launched. We are in 2023, wherein there are 200 plus public cloud service providers that exist as we speak, 200 plus. Some of them are global that you already know, and some of them are regional. And they all follow the same method, same format when they build cloud services. So if you have good understanding of one cloud, it hardly takes couple of days to understand the other cloud. It is not that you will take months to understand the other cloud. It is just a matter of few days to understand the other cloud. So that is why one cloud is very important. And Microsoft Azure by far has been the simplest cloud that I have ever experienced. Because if you start your journey with AWS, you will find it complicated. If you started with GCP, it is more complicated. Why? Because it doesn't follow the basics. It doesn't follow what you have learned so far. They follow, but in a different language, in a different way. And that's where you will find it difficult. You will say, why they can't keep it simple? Why are they unnecessarily complicating it? What is the need of doing it? So that is what the other cloud is all about, which is where Microsoft Azure becomes very user-friendly. So we create a virtual network in cloud. And when we create a virtual network, we segment this virtual network. So why do we segment? So that we basically break down this virtual network into multiple segments which are known as subnets in cloud language. In Azure language, we call them subnets. And we create these subnets to host application tiers or to host a specific set of application in the subnets. And why do we use subnets? So that we can apply controls. Similarly, in on-premises networking, if you have experience with on-premises networking, you have a LAN, which is local area network, a big address space that you break it down into multiple VLANs, and then you allocate those VLANs to specific departments, and you apply access control list, which is ACL, to control the traffic that goes in and comes out of the VLAN. That's what we do in on-premises. Similarly, in cloud, we create a virtual network. We segment that virtual network into multiple subnets, and we apply controls at the subnet level. So we can apply control at subnet level, and we can also apply control at VM level. That is why we create network. Now, now there could be a scenario that you will have multiple networks. So what organizations typically do, they create multiple networks and they earmark those networks based on the application environment. So probably you have a production network, you have a non-production network, you may have a separate network for an application also. I'm saying there could be an application that you want to segregate with the rest of the world uh, from other applications also within the environment. You can create an application network also, a network which is dedicated to a specific application. Or you can collocate all the applications, all production applications in one network, which basically means that you may have subnets like inside the network, you can create subnet like web subnet, app subnet, PV subnet, or you can say front end, middle tier, backend subnet, management subnet. You can create subnet like this, and with this approach, you can put multiple web servers belonging to separate applications, multiple application servers, multiple database servers here, and you can apply security controls at the subnet level that what kind of traffic will be allowed. So a common example of it would be that I don't want to allow any traffic from web subnet to the DB subnet because web is my front end subnet. My users are directly connecting to the subnet, which means this subnet is most vulnerable to security misconfigurations or security incidents. So I don't want anything from web. So I don't want any traffic from web subnet to basically directly go to the DB subnet because this is where my databases are. Databases are mission critical to my business and my application. They contain all the data. So I don't want any traffic from web to DB. I want my traffic to get routed from web to app to DB. So this is something that we can apply in network using a service which is network security group. In short, we call it NSG. And the people who are into operations, Sentinel operations, you you must have seen that you're also receiving logs from NSG. So what happens? Those logs from NSGs are basically sent to a log analytics workspace, and log analytics workspace is added to Sentinel service. So inside Sentinel, you are getting all the logs from NSGs, and those logs are all the incoming and outgoing traffic or anything which is an anomaly goes into the Sentinel. And Sentinel will then process it and create incidents and events. So network security group is the service through which I can control the traffic which flows from one subnet to another. Now, before network security group, I have another service which is firewall. So I can provision a firewall at the perimeter layer, and all the traffic which comes to my network has to pass through this firewall, and it will be filtered based on the policies which I have configured at the firewall level. If it satisfies the policies, it will be allowed to move further, and then it has to go through the NSG. So it's a dual layer of protection that I'm putting in place. in my network. So that is what we do at the network level from the security perspective. And network is one of the core service in the landing zone or minimum viable cloud. Without a network, you will hardly be able to build any service in Azure. Every service needs a network. So this is about networking that you need to know. Now, we also, follow, so understand this name Gartner and Forrester. If you have not, because people who are into security domain, the, these names are very important for them, because Gartner and Forresters are two analyst firm in the world who has a great influence on businesses, on decision makers. The reports and analysis that they provide, businesses or decision maker will trust that report and analysis, and they will take actions accordingly. So if Gartner says something, if Gartner comes up with a technology that says EDR, if Gartner says this, if Gartner says, so these are the terminology that Gartner is introduced. Now, it is not that you are not doing, you're not taking care of this domain or taking care of this capability. You already are taking care of it. But Gartner has just came up with a new terminology. Gartner has added some additional key pointers and keywords here. And now all the security service providers or ISVs, integrated, product vendors, they are now taking care of it. So EDR stands for endpoint detection and response. Now, in Microsoft world, the EDR is Windows Defender. Don't call it Windows Defender, call it Microsoft Defender. So that's the EDR solution in Microsoft world. Now, what is this EDR solution? It is nothing but an antivirus. It is nothing but an anti-malware. It is nothing but an anti-spyware. That's what these solutions are. So why do we call them EDR then? This is how technology has evolved over the last couple of years. So you have experts, analysts like Gartner. They came up with the terminologies. They say that the existing solution is not sufficient. It must have some additional capabilities included in it. And after you include those capabilities, the solution becomes EDR. So an antivirus from McAfee, Symantec, AVG becomes an EDR solution because it has added some additional capabilities to it. Similarly, CSPM. So we'll be talking about these terminologies. So this is what you need to know when it comes to the networking, defense in depth. So defense in depth, you need to understand that what is this model, what is zero trust, what is SIEM, what is CWPP. Try and understand these terminologies. They will help you in security domain. Now, some people in the group must be thinking, why are we doing all this? We are here for Sentinel training. So just to clarify your doubt, Sentinel needs all of this. Sentinel will need data coming from all of these services. Do not think what DXC does. Do not think what a customer of DXC has in place. When you are learning a service, learn it from a point, all the capabilities of the service that you currently have configured, or that you don't have. For example, if you're working with a customer and customer has only two services configured, is that all that Sentinel can do? No. Sentinel has more capabilities. How will you suggest it to the customer? Unless and until you know it. So first you learn it and then go back to your customer and say, sir, you know what? I also know that you have some additional services that we can add to Sentinel. We can integrate them with Sentinel because it has capability to monitor those services also. That is what Sentinel is here for. So you need to have good understanding of all of this because that's what Sentinel can integrate with and Sentinel can work with. Now, they are not services, they are terminologies, and these terminologies basically influence services. So CSPM stands for Cloud Security Posture Management. You have solutions like Microsoft Defender for Cloud here. You have solutions like Prisma here. You have solutions like Zscaler, CSPM here. So there are multiple vendors who are who are providing these solutions. So you need to have understanding of these solutions because Sentinel has data collectors for these solutions actually. Similarly, defense in depth is nothing but a terminology that was provided, which basically says that instead, I'm saying merely protecting perimeter is not sufficient these days because nowadays you have more security, your attack surface area or security incidents has increased. So you need to enable layered security approach wherein you need to put security controls and security services at each layer of your network. Only the perimeter protection is not sufficient. Zero trust says don't trust anybody. Don't even trust your colleague. Don't trust your manager. Don't trust your junior. Always verify. Assume that the breach has happened. Don't give administrative access to anyone. Provide it on time basis. CIM is more on the identity and entitlement management. That how do you manage identity lifecycle? CWPP is Cloud Workload Protection Platform, which Microsoft Defender for Cloud is also one of them. So in Sentinel, we are going to ingest logs from all of these solutions. And we will be using Microsoft Defender for Cloud here. And we will be ingesting logs from Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And we will intentionally do some security misconfigurations. We will intentionally try to break into our Azure account. We will intentionally try to break into virtual machines by providing incorrect credentials, similar as if we are initiating a brute force attack so that Sentinel will get some feed. Sentinel will get some data that we will see and we will troubleshoot or we will configure in the lab. So this is why this is all important for you need to understand. Any questions so far, guys? All right. Other than this in networking, you also need to understand some additional concepts, which is Bastion host, UDR, peering, WAF, which stands for Web Application Firewall. So Bastion Host is a service that is provided by Microsoft, which is a Microsoft managed service. This is nothing but a jump host. This is a service or a machine in the backend, which is configured with a public IP. You configure that service inside your network, and using this service, you can connect to your virtual machine instances on a secure channel. You don't need to expose your virtual machines with public IP by allocating public IPs to their network interface so that you can take a remote or SSH into them. UDR is very important, which is user defined routes. In Azure Cloud, we don't talk about routing a lot because routing is managed by the virtual network. But in AWS and GCP, routing has a great significance. Every service that you configure will require a route to be configured against that service inside the subnet, inside the VPC, inside the network. So what is this user defined route? User defined route is basically, let's say you have an environment, let's say you have a couple of servers in your network, and you basically want to control the outbound traffic from those servers. So you will not block internet on the servers, but you would want that secure website should be open from the internet only, or you would want to control the content that user will browse on the internet. So you can define UDR, user defined routes. And what happens in user defined routes, you will basically select that what will be the next stop. I'm saying when traffic leaves from a server, will it directly go to the internet? If there is an internet bound traffic, let's say you type yahoo.com in the web browser of your server, it will directly connect you to the Yahoo website. But before it reaches Yahoo, should it go through some additional service where it will be inspected? That is where UDR comes into the picture. So using UDR, you can force tunnel the traffic to a specific service. And that service could be your firewall. It could be a proxy server. or it could be on-premises security service. That's what UDR is all about. So we configure UDR a lot in Azure, and the logs from UDR is also sent to Sentinel. I'm saying all the network flow logs that also passes via UDR is sent to Sentinel so that you can evaluate those logs and identify any anomaly there. Then comes peering. Peering is a concept wherein you will connect multiple networks together. So by default in Azure, virtual network provides isolation, which means if I have two virtual networks, which is virtual network A and virtual network B, the resources inside virtual network A and B cannot talk to each other because both networks are isolated. But if there is a use case wherein you want to connect, you want to allow resources or services inside virtual network and B to talk to each other, you will need to peer both the virtual networks, connect both the virtual networks, and that is known as peering. So it is very simple to configure, and after the peering is configured, both the virtual networks behave as one, and services can talk to each other. However, you need to understand some prerequisites. First, if you are connecting two virtual networks, their address space must not coincide and overlap. So they should not have an overlapping and coinciding address space. If they have overlapping and coinciding address space, then you cannot connect those two virtual networks. That is why networking is very important in cloud, because networking you will configure once and you will consume this service forever. So it has to be configured after a very careful and thoughtful planning, because you will not configure the network keeping in consideration what you need today. You will also configure your network taking into consideration what will be your long-term goals, or what is your expansion goals, or how you will grow in cloud, and where you see yourself, let's say 6 months, 1 year, 5 year down the line. Accordingly, you will configure the network in cloud. Web application firewall is another type of firewall which works at layer 7 of OSI layer, which is application layer. And this type of firewall protects your application from layer 7 attacks. The example are cross-site scripting attack, SQL injection, etc. So that's what web application firewall is. In Azure, web application firewall is not a separate service. It is part of a type of load balancer, which is application gateway. So Azure has multiple load balancing service. Azure has uh, Azure load balancer, which is both public and internal. Application gateway, you know, you have front door, and you have traffic manager. They are the four load balancing service in Azure. So application gateway is a type of load balancer that is an intelligent load balancer which works at layer 7. And with application gateway, you configure web application firewall, and you configure policies in the firewall using which you can protect your application from layer 7 attack. That's what web application firewall is. So we also sent logs from web application firewall and application gateway and various networking services to Sentinel. So this is about networking. I'm at a very high level about networking that I wanted to complete. So my next service that I need to look for is information and data protection. So this is the next domain that I need to be looking into, information and data protection. Now, what is this information and data protection? This is one of the cloud security or cyber security domain in which we deal with data, and we deal with process of securing this data, security of the data. Now, how do you secure the data in cloud? Before you even get into the security of the data, you first need to understand your data repositories. You need to know all your data repositories. You need to know where exactly you have your data saved, stored. So first you need to get full visibility of your data repositories. Once you get full visibilities of the repositories, then you will need to look into that data, and if the data is in petabytes or if it is in hundreds of terabytes, thousands of terabytes, then you will need to be able to classify and label the data. So classify and label the data so that you will know, okay, this data is mission critical to my business. This data is public data. I can afford to lose this data. This data is internal data. This data is personal. This data is private. So there are labels that you can apply to the data. So once you apply those labels, then you will need to protect the data. So let's say you will apply labels on the data. Now, if DXC is using uh, you know data protection, I'm sure you are using, so you can go to your Outlook, and on the top right corner you will see an option that says sensitivity label. If you see that option, sensitivity label, it means you're using Azure information protection or Microsoft information protection as part of an offering from M365. So which basically means that when you are receiving and sending emails, you can apply labels to those emails. And basis on the labels that you will apply, the appropriate DLP policy will take place and will safeguard your information. So if you are attaching, let's say you apply confidential label to an email, and then you attach some file to it, whosoever you are sending that file to, that person will also need an additional password to open that file. That will be sent separately by AIP, by the service. That person will not be able to, based on the configuration, forward that email to anybody within DXC, outside of DXC, based on the DLP policy and configuration. So that is what is DLP is all about, that you configure, which is data leak prevention. And labels are like confidential. These are some common label example: business, internal, or you can say public. These are the labels. These are the examples of labels that you can create. And based on the DLP policies will be created. Now DLP basically is applied at the host level. Host level basically means on your endpoint, and edge level. This is where you apply DLP, which basically means, and I'm 100% sure on your laptop, you have an EDR solution that has DLP configured. So you can check which EDR solution you have on your laptop. And because of that EDR solution, you're not able to connect a flash drive to your laptop and copy any data from your official laptop, or upload any data to your laptop. And so you cannot transmit in and out any data because all the ports are blocked. You cannot upload any data to cloud storage because the DLP is taking care of it. You cannot transmit any official data to an external domain, which means you cannot send any email to Gmail from your official email address. From dxc.com to gmail.com, you should not be able to send. If you are able to send, then your DLP is actually is configured at monitor level. And if you're not able to send, then it is configured at enforce level. So this is how we configure DLP from the monitoring level or the enforce level. Monitoring means you will be allowed to do whatever you wish to, but because of that activity, a security incident will be logged. A log will be created and it will be sent to the SOC team. That is what DLP configured at monitor level. Enforce level basically means that you will not be allowed to do that. And so the moment you will type gmail.com in the Outlook under the sender address, it will quickly give you a prompt that you're not allowed to send emails to an external domain. And it may also send a log to SOC team informing them that the user was trying to send an email to gmail.com, which is not allowed. So that is what DLP is all about. And for sure, your laptop may have an EDR solution with DLP configured at monitor or enforce level that I don't know. So that's what you need to know in data security. Then after you have classified and labeled your data and applied the DLP controls, then you will need to have encryption in place. And you will need to encrypt your data, you will need to encrypt your files put at rest I'm saying when those files are kept stored into a disk or into a storage account. So encryption at rest, encryption in transit, and also encryption in use. So these are the encryption methods that you need to configure. Now, at rest is by default provided in cloud. All the cloud service providers by default encrypt your data at rest. Encryption in transit, you will need to configure. Encryption in use, you will need to configure. So encryption is very important because only doing this is not sufficient unless you encrypt the data. So what I'm talking about is data security life cycle. This is the life cycle of my data security, that whenever my data is getting created, I will first need to identify what that repository is, classify and label my data, apply DLP policies, ensure that the encryption is configured for both at rest, in transit, and use. And then in the end, now I will also need to configure backup and disaster recovery of my data, which is very important. And in the end is the discard. How do you discard the data? And for that, I should be using crypto shredding. So this is my entire data security life cycle that I need to be aware of as a security professional. Now, the beauty of cloud security, understand cyber security and cloud security. So cyber security has 9 domains, and you will find people expert in one domain. I'm say somebody who is an IM professional, somebody who is a network security professional, somebody who is a data security professional, somebody is specializing in application security, somebody who deals with virtualization. So there are multiple domains, multiple fields here. But when it comes to cloud security, there are no standard domains. Organizations, businesses create domains based on their understanding. So when it comes to cloud security, and if you are part of cloud, and if you are into cloud security, you will be you will feel proud of the fact that you know almost all domains. Because being a cloud security professional, it is not sufficient for you to only know data security. You will need to have equal competence on network security also. You will need to have equal competence on compute and database security also. You will need to have equal competence on other domains also. So if you get into cloud security domain, you will find yourself getting a good comfort level with all the security domains. However, if you stick to cyber security, you will only stick to one domain. So somebody who is a cloud security professional is a person who has depth of understanding across one or two domains and good breadth of understanding across all the domains. That's what cloud security is all about. And that is why before you become a cloud security professional, this fundamental and basic understanding is very important. So you don't become a cloud security within a year or two of joining an organization. It takes a couple of years of practice and association with these technologies that will make you a cloud security professional. So today, if I can talk about any domain, and if I can talk about best practices, or if I know a couple of tools across each domain of cloud security, it is because I have spent my last 20 years of journey, last 20 years of experience here. That is why I know all of it and I remember them at my fingertips. And you can put me in front of any security professional coming from any domain. I will be able to talk to that person efficiently with the same comfort level because I've done all that and I continue to do that. And I know what is changing in the environment. And that is exactly what you need to know. See, working in security monitoring, because this is what you are doing at the end of the day. You are either configuring the security monitoring or you are working in security monitoring team. Unless and until you have understanding on all that I have explained here from the top, trust me, you will not be able to do justice to this domain. You will continue, I'm saying you will be able to see what is there, but all the time you will keep forwarding it to your level 2 and level 3 all the time because you don't have that level of knowledge. But if you have that level of knowledge, you will be able to analyze and interpret a security incident and be able to remediate and address it at your level itself because you know the concepts. Even if you're not allowed to do that, you don't have that permission, you will be able to forward it to the right team by putting in right inputs that this is what needs to be done. And when they receive it from you, they will appreciate you for the level of knowledge, the depth of knowledge that you have. And slowly and gradually, you will find yourself moving to that level because they will quickly be able to take you as part of their team. So from L1 to L2 to L3, the journey will be quicker. But if you just consider what you need to do all the time, you will not be able to move to that level. This is how I have moved. I'm saying when I used to be somebody whose job is to provision the services, I would not only provision the service, I would look at the various configurations which are involved and what my next level does. And I started doing it all by myself or started giving them inputs. And they were really impressed with the fact that I know over and above what my core responsibilities are. And when the time comes, I was quickly absorbed into the next level without any effort. I did not have to apply for it. They automatically took me in because they knew that the person is ready for the next level. That's exactly what you need to do. So if you're at level one, understand what level two does. If you're at level two, understand what level three does. Try and learn it. Try and do it. Give them the confidence that you can do it, that you're ready for this level. So that's what you will be doing. So that was about data security that you need to understand. And most important here is not this part, because for this part, you will have a separate team, but this part you need to understand. As a security professional, you need to understand encryption and backup and disaster recovery. Crypto shredding is the method. So you already know that there are recovery softwares. If now what organizations does, uh, they basically, so typically you get a laptop from your company and and you use that laptop for 3 4 years and then you give it back to your company. They will issue you a new laptop. What happens to the old laptop? Or you have a drive where you have saved your mission critical data. The drive is 5 7 years old. Now you purchase another drive and you copy all the data to the new drive. What happens to the old drive? So what happens to these data repositories? You basically discard them. Now, when you discard these data repositories, or sometimes organizations as their CSR activity, donate these laptops to NGOs, and NGOs will then assign these laptops to other people. There is a high probability that the data can be recovered because you have recovery softwares available. And if that data is recovered and if it goes into the hands of your competition, you will be at loss. So that is where we do crypto shredding, which basically means that before we before we delete the data or before we shred the data, we will encrypt it once again so that if somebody is able to recover it by using a recovery software, they will still not be able to decrypt the data because we have used crypto shredding. So this is the right approach. What I'm teaching you is the security consulting, that this is what we tell to our customers when it comes to a specific domain and the best practices. Now, what tool you will use is the secondary thought because that's the next level. It depends whether there is a native tool available in cloud. If not, then what is the best enterprise tool available to do this? So that's what security, data security is all about. My Any question on data security, guys? Okay. Next is compute security. So when I say compute, I'm actually referring to virtual machines. I'm actually referring to container instances. I'm actually referring to Azure Kubernetes services. I'm referring to compute services. Whether they are serverless or server, it hardly makes any difference. So how do I protect my compute services? So when it comes to protecting your compute services, first of all, you need to understand what that service is. Let's take an example of a virtual machine. Can somebody tell me how do you protect a virtual machine in Azure? Any participant? What you will do to protect a virtual machine? Yogesh, what can we do to protect a virtual machine?
I think we can create inbound and outbound rules for that machine.
Okay. So what you are saying that we can protect virtual machine from the network perspective. We can apply control at the network level to filter the traffic before it reaches the virtual machine. Am I correct?
Yes.
But that's the network security. I'm specifically talking about virtual machine. That what can I do to protect my virtual machine?
You can
What can I
assign what groups can access that box through
absolutely
your AD. Yep.
absolutely. So we can configure the IDs, we can configure the identities and grant access accordingly to the virtual machine. What else? So all the virtual machines, when I refer to virtual machine, I'm actually referring to an operating system. Because see, virtual machine is nothing but CPU and memory. Then it has a separate service in the name of storage attached to it, which is disk. Then it has a separate service in the name of network attached to it, which is network interface card, where the IP addresses are configured. So virtual machine is nothing but CPU and memory. It's compute. So we configure network controls, we configure identity controls, and then we also have a firewall inside the virtual machine. If you ever noticed, every operating system has a virtual firewall. For example, Windows Defender. It's part of operating system. So we can also configure the firewall inside the virtual machine to allow or deny a specific traffic. We can configure inbound, outbound rules in the firewall. Every virtual machine has native antivirus software, which is EDR capabilities, like Windows Defender. Once again, we can configure the EDR solution inside the virtual machine. What else we can do from the data perspective? How can I protect a virtual machine from the data perspective?
We can use DLP.
Absolutely. So data perspective, we can use DLP. In fact,
Yep.
for data
Also
perspective,
backups.
absolutely. We need to separate the data across volumes. So inside virtual machines, you have drive, C drive, D drive, E drive, F drive. You will need to separate the data across volumes. Those drives are known as volumes in technology terminology. We need to separate the volume based on the data that it contains. And accordingly, we need to encrypt the volumes. That's what we can do. You've rightly said backup and disaster recovery. We need to configure backup and DR for virtual machines. So these are some of the security configurations that we can do for virtual machines. Why do you need to know all of this? Because if you are using Sentinel and if you're getting logs from your virtual machines and if you're not receiving logs related to these services, which either means that the service is not configured or logs are not getting streamed. And in both cases, it is your responsibility as an operations team or engineering team to look into the configuration and fix it. If it is misconfigured, if it is not existing, then you need to configure it. Now, nowadays, when you work, when you are providing MSSP services, it is not that you are only providing security services, security monitoring. I'm saying there is a high probability that you have a separate team within DXC who is also responsible for managed services operations, who's providing managed services to the client also, which is 24 into 7 managed services. And they are basically responsible for the configuration. So if you find a configuration is missing, you can connect with your managed services team and request them to configure it so that the logs are getting streamed into Sentinel. It is about going extra mile, doing something which should be there, which will make your customer happy, because that's what you can represent it to the customer. And so your management will go back to the customer and say, this is what we have done over and above, what was initially configured. So this is why you basically need to know all of this. So that was my compute security, that I should have, network controls, identity controls, firewall controls, data controls enabled, including backup and DR and encryption on my compute, which is very important. Okay. Now, other than this, Microsoft also provides you confidential computing capabilities. Now, this confidential computing is nothing but a specific type of virtual machine which has the capability which is protected, which is more protected than the typical virtual machine. So for any confidential data, you should use confidential computing. That is very important. And you've already said that you should have EDR and DLP solutions configured at the virtual machine level, at the endpoint level, which is very important. So that's on the compute security. Okay. Then comes governance and compliance. Next topic, which is very important. And this has very great significance with Sentinel also. So governance and compliance. Now, what is the, so people who have worked with Azure or who have good knowledge of Azure, can you tell me what are the governance and compliance services in Azure? Any governance and compliance service that you're aware of in Azure?
GDPR.
GDPR is not a GDPR is a compliance in Europe. It's not a service. It's like a law. It's a regulatory standard. I'm talking about a service in Azure using which you can assess whether you are compliant to GDPR or not. What is that service? Okay, that service is Microsoft Defender for Cloud. It's a CSPM solution. It has CWPP capabilities also, and it has much more capabilities. So my services in Azure to manage governance and compliance is Azure Policy, Azure Blueprint, Azure Purview, Azure Active Directory. How can we forget this? Azure Management Groups. So these are my services for governance and compliance in Azure. And logs from all of these services are sent in Sentinel. In any large enterprise, if they are using Microsoft Azure, you will find them using these services, and they will have enabled logging from these services to Sentinel for sure. And if it is not there, it is your responsibility as an engineering function or as an operational function to suggest your customer to stream logs from these services to Sentinel. These are your governance and compliance services. Now, Microsoft Defender, we will continue to speak in detail, throughout Sentinel because it has great integration. Azure Policy is a service in Azure using which you can enforce org standards and you can assess compliance at scale. So let's say you have a policy in your company that nobody should be able to provision virtual machine with public IP, or nobody should be able to provision a virtual machine of a specific SKU. SKU means size of the virtual machine because it is directly related to cost. If you have such, or you have a policy that you have some storage accounts which are hosting mission critical data, nobody should be able to delete those storage accounts. Nobody should be able to provision a new storage account. So if you want to enforce some standards and assess the current level of compliance against that standard, the service is Azure Policy. Similarly, you have Blueprint service, you have Purview service. Purview is basically for data security. Using Purview service, Purview can quickly discover all your data repositories because it has MIP capabilities inbuilt. It can look at the labels of those data containers or files and folders, and it can quickly tell you what all files contain sensitive data, but they are not labeled properly. So that's Purview is all about. This can quickly help you remain compliant. Let's say you need to remain compliant to GDPR, and GDPR says that data of any European citizen or European business should not be stored, processed, or transmitted outside of the European Union, outside of the geographical boundaries of European Union. And you have Sentinel configured. Now, Sentinel is configured in India because the company name is ABC, which is a multinational company which also has business in Europe. So they have a couple of offices in Europe. And as part of that offices, there are European citizens who are employed in those offices. There is an HR who is managing the, you know, personal information of those employees with respect to their personal information as well as their pay scale, finances, and everything. And there is SAP that you have configured, and all the data is stored into the SAP. Now you have Sentinel. Sentinel is configured in India. Why? Because you have a centralized security monitoring team who is based out of India. So that team is taking care of all the security monitoring. Now Sentinel is ingesting logs from Europe to India. In those logs, there is some PII data which is getting referenced. It's a pure violence of GDPR. If they ever come to know, you will be sanctioned and penalized. So how do you configure Sentinel then? What if, how do you configure Sentinel to remain compliant with various regulatory standards and compliances is what you need to know. And that is where Purview can help you quickly. Purview can quickly tell you which file contains what type of data. In fact, Purview can quickly assess your logs into the log analytics workspace and can quickly tell you that out of 1,000 logs, which specific log contains PII information, personal identifiable information. And then you can look into that log and find out the source of that log. If that log is coming from Europe, then you clearly know that you are in violation of GDPR. Then you will need to change your strategy. And that's what we will discuss into the design phase when we design the Sentinel architecture. Okay, so that's Purview. Then comes Azure Active Directory. I've already explained you. Azure Management Groups. It is a strategy through which you will manage multiple Azure subscriptions from one place, and you will be able to control them. You will be able to configure identities, configure policies, configure billing from one place. That's what management group is. So those are the governance and compliance services in Azure, which has the capability to stream data into a workspace which is attached to Sentinel. And so whatever services I'm talking about here, I have actually either personally configured that services into Sentinel, or I have guided the teams, I'm saying the junior team members, as to how to configure these services into Sentinel so that you can also get visibility from these services also. So these are very important services for Sentinel. So that was the governance and compliance part. Any question on this? Okay. If there are no questions, let's move on. My next service is very important service, which is Microsoft Defender for Cloud. I'll share this Word document with you. This is my Azure subscription, which I will be using for this training. Is everyone logged into your respective Azure subscription? Yes, no, maybe.
Yes, Rajat.
Okay. So what we are going to do, we are going to enable Microsoft Defender for Cloud here so that it will start to capture the logs from today onwards. And when we integrate it with Sentinel, Sentinel will have at least some logs coming into it. So how do I enable it? You will need to type Microsoft in the search Defender. I'm saying either you type it complete or you type the first few letters and you will see the options here. So the options, so one of the service that you see here with the name Microsoft Defender for Cloud, you need to click on this service. And when you click on this service, you see this page. This is the landing page of Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Now, when you reach to this landing page, you will see something similar, which will say that you are eligible for a 30 days free trial of Defender. 30 days is our validity of this subscription. So we will need to, I would say by default, Microsoft Defender basic plan is available. In the basic plan, you have very less capabilities available. And basic plan also does not integrate well with Sentinel. So any organization who is using Defender, they would have enabled the standard plan. They will not go with the basic plan because it does not provide all the capabilities or the required capabilities. So you basically upgrade from basic to standard. So at the bottom, you all will see an option that says upgrade. Please click on upgrade. Okay. So when I clicked on upgrade, now it has been upgraded to the standard plan. After this has been upgraded to standard plan, I will see my Defender window like this. I will see some widgets on the screen. I will see some boxes, security posture, regulatory compliance, workload protection, and inventory. And I will see some resources here. This is what you get after you upgrade. After you have upgraded, you will need to enable the services in the Defender. So how do we enable services in the Defender? We will need to click on environment settings under management. Under management, there is an option that says environment settings. When it goes and in the environment settings, under environment settings, you will see your Azure subscription, which is Azure Pass sponsorship. You will need to click on it. When you click on it, the first option will be Defender plans. So here you will see all the capabilities of Defender that you can include. So you need to make sure that all the plans are enabled. Because when you register for Defender trial or when you upgrade for a trial, you get all the plans enabled by default, which basically means if it is not enabled, you just need to drag the radio button to the right. I'm saying just drag it to the right, click on the on button everywhere, and all the plans will be enabled. Now look at the capabilities that Defender brings on the table. Defender can protect your servers. It can protect app services. It can protect databases. It can protect storage accounts. It can protect containers. It can protect Key Vault. It can protect Resource Manager, DNS, API, and Microsoft will continue to add more capabilities to Defender. So this is what all of you need to enable and validate that this is enabled. There is also an option that says enable all plans. You can also click here and it will enable all the plans of Defender by default. Since we are going for the trial of Defender for 30 days, and since this is a prepaid subscription valid for 30 days only, let's use it to the fullest. Let's evaluate the capabilities of expensive services also. So we will need to enable Defender for all of this. Is everyone done with this? And after you enable, then you need to save on the top. Since it is enabled already for me, I am not getting the save option. But if it is not enabled, any of the services not enabled that you will manually enable, on the top you will see save option. Click on save to save the setting.
Yeah, hi Ragvir, sorry to interrupt. Can you
Yes.
please repeat the steps from the environment settings because we are using Alt tab to do this one. So we don't
Or,
have any extension monitor or display to do. So we are using
okay,
Alt tab to do this.
okay. No worries. Let me show you all over again. So you will first need to navigate to Defender service. Once you are in Defender service, you will directly see an option to upgrade the Defender. Even if you don't see an option, that's okay. Directly go to environment settings under management. To your left, you will have all of these options. Under management, there is an option that says environment settings. click on environment settings, and then you will see this window. Inside this window, you will see the Defender capabilities. That Defender can be used to secure AWS accounts, GCP projects, GitHub, Azure DevOps. This is the capability. And right now there is one Azure subscription, which is your Azure Pass sponsorship subscription. You need to click on this subscription. When you click on it, it opens another window that says under settings Defender for Defender plans. And this is where you need to ensure that all the plans are enabled. All the plans should be on. And if they are not on, then you need to turn them on. All of them you need to click on. And then on the top, there is an option to save it. So you need to click on save them. Once you save it, all the plans will be enabled. Right now, you don't have these services, but we will provision these services and they will be protected by Defender from day one. So this is like building the landing zone. We are building and provisioning and configuring the bare minimum services in cloud before we start to migrate our first application or before we start to build our first application into the cloud. Yes, Nilkant, do you have any question?
Yes, I mean, I have clicked on enable all plans, but it is not showing me save option.
Save, it was grayed out.
No, if save is grayed out, it means that all the plans are already enabled.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
If the moment you click on upgrade on the first screen, it will by default enable everything. You will see save option if I disable any plan. See, if I turn off any plan, then the save option will be visible. Because save will only come when you make some changes to the screen. I have just turned it off, the server plan, and the save option is available. If I turn it back on, save will be disabled because it was already enabled. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that is what you need to do to enable the Defender. And say we have enabled the Defender now. Is everyone done with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So we have just enabled Defender, which is a governance service in Microsoft Azure, using which I can protect my Azure resources, which includes my servers, virtual machines, databases, and all the capabilities that Defender brings on the table. And since I've enabled all the plans, if in future Defender launches any plan, it will be by default enabled. So that's what we have enabled. Now, one of the participants says GDPR. Now, if you want to configure, if you want to enable a compliance in Defender so that Defender can quickly assess your subscription and see whether you are adhering to that compliance, whether you are not adhering to it, or whether you are partially adhering to it, Defender will give you intelligence or will tell you what is your current secure score against the compliance or what is the percentage of adherence to the compliance. This is what we enable from here. So on the same page where it says Defender plans, underneath policy settings, you will see security policies. Do you all see that?
Yes.
You will need to click on security policies, and then it will show you the default initiative, which is ASC default. This is the default that it has enabled, in which it has 198 controls. And this is Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmarks, which is the default best practices. But other than this, you can enable this. You can see Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, which is default enabled. Out of the box, it is enabled. Don't disable it. And rest 3, PCI, DSS, ISO, and SOC TSP, they are deprecated because an enhanced and updated version of these standards are available. So this is where it says add more standards. Click on add more standards, and here you will see all the standards which are available in Defender, and you can enable. Let's see whether GDPR is there. You can search for GDPR in the search bar. You don't see GDPR like this. You will need to type the full form. which is general. My mouse stopped working. So you can look for GDPR in this and you can enable GDPR. So do we have GDPR, NIST, UCO, Canada, Azure, HIPAA, SWIFT, ISO, New Zealand, NIST, FedRAMP, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Azure, PCI DSS. Okay, so you don't see GDPR right now. The reason you don't see GDPR right now because you have created this. Okay, just give me a moment because GDPR must be there. Let me just double check in my other account whether GDPR is part of that account because GDPR used to be there. Why don't you see GDPR? Let me just double check. This is my production account. Let me see the production account. Okay, NIST, UCO, HIPAA. Okay, it's not there. It seems that they have removed it. So they have removed GDPR from the compliance here. Probably we are not seeing GDPR because we have created this account in a country which is not covered under GDPR. I still remember looking at GDPR until last month when we enabled Defender. Today I don't see it, so probably Microsoft has removed GDPR from accounts which are created in a country where GDPR does not apply. So that's why you don't see GDPR, but you see other controls. So what we need to enable in Defender is PCI DSS4, which is the latest version. Just click on add. When you click on add, it will create a policy for that compliance. Just hit review plus create and then hit create. It will add PCI DSS4. So PCI DSS4 is enabled. Whatever compliance you will enable, you will see it under industry and regulatory standards. So you can see you've just enabled PCI DSS4. It is now showing manually added. Similarly, you can also enable CIS. CIS is in Center for Internet Security. CIS has benchmarks for all the cloud service provider. Let's enable Azure CIS 1.4.0, which is the latest control. So let's click on add. Similarly, you will need to hit review plus create and create. So what you are doing right now, you're giving instructions to Defender that this is what you need to do. These are the compliances that you need to assess my configuration against and tell me whether my configuration adheres or is in compliant to these standards. So these are the bare minimum that you need to configure. PCI DSS, Azure CIS, and let's see if we have ISO 27017, ISO 27001, 2013. You also need to enable this. So review plus create, create. And other than this, if you feel there is any specific standard or compliance which you would like to evaluate or which you would like to understand in detail, you can also enable it from this list. For example, in India, we have a framework that RBI has created for NBFCs, non-banking financial corporations. All NBFCs have to adhere to this standard. So if you are interested in this, you can also enable it. My participants from Australia, if you are interested in this compliance, Australian government ISM protected, you can also enable it. And once you enable this compliance, then you will see the appropriate controls which are there as part of this compliance and what exactly those controls are all about and how do you adhere or how do you provision resources in Azure so that they comply to those controls. So we'll need to enable all of it. Now, once you enable all of it, all that is your areas of interest, Defender will start to assess your subscription against against the controls which are there in this compliance. And when it does, and if it finds any anomaly, and since it has integration with Sentinel, that will be sent to Sentinel console, and Sentinel L1 engineer will receive that as an event and will then create an incident out of it and either resolve it by itself or send it to the appropriate team who is responsible to resolve or remediate that misconfiguration. So this is what we are going to do. So let me know when you guys are done with enabling all the compliance that you need to. Okay, my next option is email notification. I will also need to enable notification for any email notification for any critical message that Defender wants to share with me. So additional email address, it says all users with the following rule. Now by default, all the users in Azure which have owner RBAC assigned to their identities will receive that email. But typically people who are Azure owners, they are not part of SOC monitoring team. So how will you notify the monitoring team then? So this is where you will type the email address of your monitoring team, the DL of your monitoring team, whatever that is, soc@dxe.com or whatever that DL is, which will then send I'm saying your SOC team will have ingestion points. So whatever is the ingestion email address, you will provide that ingestion email address here in the additional email address box. Now, when you provide this email address, what kind of notification you want to receive. So it is already configured. You can see notify about alerts with the following severity or higher, which is high. So you've already configured that you would want to get notified from Defender to all the owners as well as this email address or this DL whenever there is any alert or whenever there is any event in Defender which has the severity as high. High severity alerts and events will be notified to these owners and additional recipients. So please configure an email address here. And save it. Is everyone done with this? Okay, so this was the initial configuration that needed to be done in Defender, that we have enabled Defender all the plans. We have enabled some compliances which are my area of interest. We've also enabled the notification email address so that all the high priority alerts and notifications can be sent to that email address. And that email address typically belongs to my security team, either the SOC team or the security team. So that's what we have configured. Now there is more that we can do, but we are not getting in detail of Defender because we don't have that enough time. But you can also configure your AWS accounts, your GCP projects, your GitHub, AWS DevOps in Defender also. So what we are going to do, we have enabled the basic functionality of Defender. And when we configure the Sentinel, we will onboard Defender into Sentinel so that all the Defender alerts and analysis can be ingested into Sentinel, and you will get more capabilities available to analyze and investigate those alerts, notification, events, and incidents. So that's what we are going to do. So after you enable all the standards and compliance, what you will see, there is a service that Defender integrates with, which basically powers Defender, which fuels the Defender, which is this service policy. So in the search, please type policy, all of you, and you will see the service policy. Let's click on this service. Give me a moment. All right, so on this window, you will see that whatever compliances and standards that you have just enabled, they are also shown here inside policy. On the policy overview blade, you see all of them here. For example, ISO 27001, PCI DSS version 4, CIS Microsoft Azure Foundation benchmarks. All of them are shown here, and you see non-compliant, non-compliant, non-compliant. Why it says non-compliant? Because right now you have a couple of resources here, and so this is very early. You have just enabled it, so you need to give them at least a couple of hours to scan the subscription and return the compliance status properly. But this is where you will see the compliance also. So policy is a service that helps you enforce standards and then assess compliance at scale, assess the current level of compliance. So probably tomorrow we'll come back to this service and we'll see what is the level of compliance. The other thing that you need to do is some resources. Unless and until you have some resources configured in the subscription, then the policy or these standards will not work properly. They need some data. So there has to be some network, some virtual machines, some applications configured in the subscription, which it will assess and compare with the controls which are there in the policy and return the status whether they are compliant or not compliant. So this is where you see the information here. Now you will see some additional policies also, which is Azure Security Center default. Now these are the default policies that has been configured, and it says it is also non-compliant, and here it shows the results. Now you can see CIS benchmark result is also coming. It says non-compliant, and I see 33% is my score. Out of 9, 3 resources are not compliant. So now it has started giving me results. Why? Because I still have some resources here. So non-compliant resources, 3 out of 9. Only 3 resources are compliant, 6 are not compliant. So this gives me all the information here. So similarly, you can see there is another policy, which is Azure Security Center data protection. It says compliant. Why? Because any data that I have in this subscription is basically encrypted. So it's compliant. So these are default, ASC default, ASC, these are the default policies, which is by default applicable in all subscriptions. And then we will enable manual standards and compliances also from Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which will reflect here. You will also see this information in Defender, but you can also see it here in the policy. So for example, if I want to see the status of CIS Microsoft Azure Foundation benchmark, I'll navigate to Defender once again. And in the Defender, under Cloud Security, to my left, under Cloud Security, there is an option that says Regulatory Compliance. So I'll click on Regulatory Compliance, and it will show me the status of the compliances. So right now, it shows me the status of Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. It shows me that there are 63 controls. Out of 44 controls are passed, and the remaining 19 controls are failed. And those controls are part of one of these domains. So we'll get back to the screen later, but this is where we see the compliance. Now, if you want to see the compliance, other compliance also that we have enabled, we will click on Manage Compliance Policies. And here you will click on the subscription. Then you will see the current compliance status for other controls also. So here you see the status for PCI DSS4, and here you see these are the controls in the PCI DSS4. You can see all the controls. And most of the compliance and standards, ultimately they talk about the same practice, same core. The language is different. So when you are compliant to a specific standard, you will see that you will be automatically compliant up to certain extent in the other standard also. So this is where you see the compliance information. Over here, you will start to see the compliance. It says you are not fully protected by Defender. So I already have enabled all of these plans. So if you see any cost, and if you see any pop-up that says that please enable the additional plans, go ahead and enable it because you're not paying anything. So tomorrow when you come back to the same screen, you will see all the standards that you have enabled here right next to Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. One by one, they all will start to appear. It's just that they need a couple of hours to do the initial analysis and return the data to you. Okay. So this is where we see how do we look for standards and compliance. Then go back to the policy once again.
Question.
Yes.
When I go to that screen under Cloud Security Benchmark, it just says you have no default policy assignment.
In the Defender for Cloud?
Yeah, where you just were.
Okay, over here. This one?
Yeah, so that first panel where it says 45 up the top left.
There's 44.
44. Yeah, it just says that I have no default policy.
So what it says that 44 out of 64 pass controls, which means that there are a total of 63 controls, including all of these. These are the controls, basically.
I get it, but I don't have, it says that I have no policy assigned. So I've followed everything that you
will say you don't
said.
see it on your screen?
No, it just says that I have no default policy assigned.
Okay, can you share your screen? Let me just double check.
Yeah. Is that working?
Not yet. Are other able to see screen?
It won't let me share for some reason. Yeah, I can't share. It just stops working.
You can't share. Is it disabled on Microsoft Teams?
Maybe.
Can a participant try to share the screen? Yogesh, can you try and share your screen? Let me just check if it is. Okay.
I'll put a screenshot in chat what I'm seeing.
Let me enhance it. Okay, so it says you don't have any default policy assignment. You need to click on Manage Compliance Policy. And in the Manage Compliance Policy, on the next screen, you will need to select your subscription.
Yep.
And on the subscription, where it says Enable All Plans, underneath you will see Foundation CSPM and Defender CSPM. You will need to enable them.
Defender CSPM is enabled.
It is enabled, right? In that case, it will come soon. I would say if Defender CSPM is enabled, then go to security policy to your left under policy settings.
Yep.
There is a security policy option. And then under default initiative, do you see an assignment that says ASC default?
Yep.
Okay. And then under standards, industry and regulatory standards, do you see Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark enabled
Yeah.
out of the box? Okay. So you see disable option basically, right?
Yep.
Okay. So which means it is enabled. It's just a matter of time. Probably it will synchronize soon, or you can sign out and sign back in, and you will start to see it because it is already enabled.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So I hope others are able to see this, Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark enabled. And when you navigate to regulatory compliance screen under cloud security, you will see some controls. And so you will see a status with respect to how many out of the controls passed. If you're not seeing it, there is another probability that you don't have any resource in the subscription. You should have at least have a storage account, a virtual network, some resources built, then only you will be able to see it.
So when did we do that?
But you can do it now. I would say you can start. This is, as I said yesterday, you can start to explore services. You can start to build resources in your subscription. So you start doing it from today onwards. Create a couple of virtual networks, create a couple of storage accounts, build some virtual machines. Just have some, resources configured in your lab so that these services will start to get data and they will start to analyze it. Yogesh, my screen is not visible because I disabled my screen sharing so that Quentin can share. Now I'll share my screen once again. Hope it is visible now. Is my screen visible to everyone?
Just
Yes.
black.
No.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Right. If you're not seeing this Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark and the status, this is only because you don't have any resources in your subscription. Now that you have enabled Defender, go ahead and build some basic services in your account. So in Defender, what we wanted to do, we wanted to enable Defender plans. This is something that we completed. We wanted to enable some regulatory standards and compliances. This is also completed. And now next step is to build resources in the subscription. Our next step is to build services and resources, and this is what we need to build at a bare minimum. So this is what you need to build. Go ahead and build, let's say, a couple of virtual networks. Couple of virtual machines. When I say virtual machines, Azure sponsorship pass has a limit of 4 CPU core. So 4 CPU core basically means that you will not be able to use more than 4 CPU cores, 4 vCPU cores. This is a limit, which means the virtual machine that you will build use B2S. So use B2S SKU for building your virtual machine because B2S SKU has 1 CPU core, and that way you will be able to build at least 4 virtual machines. Now, when you build 4 virtual machines, build 3 Windows virtual machines and 1 Linux virtual machines so that you also understand the Linux part in Azure. But if you are more comfortable with Windows and you have not worked with Linux in the past, then leave it. Then only build Windows. But if you want to learn Linux part also, build Linux virtual machines also. Then you will need to build a couple of storage accounts. When I say couple, it basically means 2, 3, 4, not one, at least 2 or more than 2. Couple of storage accounts. Create storage accounts and then upload some data. Upload some sample data into it so that you will also have Defender, assessing the data which is kept. So this is what you need to build: virtual machines, virtual network, storage accounts. And if you know how to build databases, then you need to provision at least one SQL DB. So that's what you need to do. This is the bare minimum that you need to provision in your subscription so that Defender will start to assess and report compliance at scale. And we will use the same configuration as data source to Sentinel. So this is a blank subscription that has been given to you. In this blank subscription, you will need to build your environment. And that environment we will monitor using security, using Microsoft Sentinel.